I'm Jamie Beebe.
And I'm Jake Deptula. We're the host of Strictly Stalking,
a weekly true crime podcast exploring true stalking stories from survivors in their own words.
We cover unique stalking cases through interviews with stalking survivors, advocates, and experts.
Strictly Stalking has been praised by survivors, advocates, listeners, and media for raising awareness about the dangerously underreported and often fatal crime of stalking.
Our series continues to provide a vital platform for stalking survivors to share their stories.
And provides anti-stalking resources for listeners along with important tips on how friends, family, and law enforcement can support stalking survivors.
Please listen now wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello listeners, and welcome to this bonus episode of The Cult Vault. I'm your speaker Casey, and for this episode I have finally sat down with Abby, survivor of the troubled teen industry and key advocate for legal reform in the US in regards to the Worldwide Association of Specialty Programs and Schools, or WASP. Very prevalent subject matter given Utah's decision to leave Maple Lake Academy open after the death of a young resident who was denied medical care until it was too late. Medical neglect is just one of the common abuses spoken about by those who have lived through one of these traumatic programs. Tomorrow, there will be an episode from Alex, survivor of Maple Lake Academy for Boys, who will be able to shed more light on this. Don't forget that you can access an entire backlog of exclusive episodes by joining my Patreon from as little as £1 a month at patreon.com/thecultvault. And CrimeCon tickets for Glasgow on September 10th are still on sale at crimecon.co.uk. You can save 10% at the checkout by entering the code CULT. We will even be getting together for an evening quiz, drinks and pizza. But for now, here is Abby. So hello, Abby, and thank you so much for agreeing to come and chat with me today about your experiences in the troubled teen industry, but also around the work that you have been doing to highlight the wrongdoings and abuse within these programs and this industry that still exists today. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Of course. My name's Abby. I'm 24. I'm originally from California, but I currently live in Maine, and I am a survivor of 2 troubled teen programs in Utah.
And for anyone who hasn't listened before or is unaware of what the TTI is there a brief summary that you could give us that details the history of the troubled teen industry, but also what it is today and the various different tangents that exist in that sort of umbrella?
Definitely. So basically, the troubled teen industry is an industry that exists primarily in the United States, but there are also programs in other countries, but they're mostly also run by people in the US. It's basically comprised of a network of largely unregulated residential programs for teenagers who can be dealing with a wide variety of behavioral, emotional, academic issues. They market themselves as therapeutic. They go under the names of like therapeutic boarding schools, residential treatment centers, wilderness programs, some religious schools, boot camps, but they are largely unregulated and underfunded. They just really have like a lot of issues in them. And that's kind of why we're pushing for more regulation and oversight.
Mm-hmm. And when you say we, what groups of people are there working in that activism space?
It's largely survivors of these programs. That's definitely the community who makes up the majority of who's doing the advocacy work. We also do have other people like parents who have sent their kids to these programs and then regretted it. We have just people who are outsiders who just learn about the industry through a news article or a movie, or they see it on the news and they want to join the fight. It's interesting because this industry is so prevalent in the United States, but nobody really seems to know it exists unless they are directly impacted by it. I definitely didn't know anything like this existed until I was sent to these programs.
We were just talking before we hit the record button about some of the advocacy work that's been happening around this movement, including a trip that you took to Washington recently, which I hope to kind of discuss in detail a little bit further on. But some of the advocacy work that you do actually includes being the moderator over on the r/troubled teen subreddit, which I reference in most of my troubled teen episodes. So I wondered if you could just give the listeners a little bit of information about that incredible resource as well.
Yeah, definitely. The troubled teen subreddit was really how I got involved in this advocacy work when I first started kind of processing my time in Utah. It's just a really great community We have everyone from survivors to parents to kids who are thinking that their parents are going to send them somewhere, just outsiders of just they learned about it and they want to learn more. It's just a really great space. And I think the community that we have on there is one of the best communities within the scope of troubled teen survivors. People do a lot of incredible work on that subreddit, and we've helped so many parents who are looking for programs for their kids, and we're able to tell them, you should not be sending your kid to these programs, or this is what's wrong with this industry, and here are some alternatives that don't, traumatize kids. And we've had a lot of parents be very, very grateful for the work that we do on there.
That sounds amazing. A lot of the survivor spaces that exist, often there are so many trauma responses and triggering content for people that survivor communities can sometimes break down and become hostile, toxic environments. So as a moderator in that space, I really appreciate how much of a task it must be to maintain that helpful and healthy environment. That does seem to be the case over on r/troubled teens, which is why I continue to recommend it to individuals when they're asking for help and support. So we'll put a link to that in the episode description, and anybody that wants to learn more, Abby's created this, I'm sure with the other moderators as well, this incredible list of resources, signposting you to various websites, information, articles, so you can really learn about the timeline of the troubled teen industry, the links between various programs, and all this wealth of information that exists on the subreddit, as well as it being a forum for survivors to get together and help one another through their experiences and recovery as well. So thank you so much, Abby, for everything that you do over there. It is such a helpful tool. Some of the pages that you sent over to me for reference regarding various programs that we're going to be discussing today, I was shocked at the links between various programs. And I know that this is common between cults and cultic groups, and also common within the troubled teen industry, overlaps and links. But the things that you sent me, I couldn't believe what I was reading. And I wonder if you still get shocked by the links and the names that pop up and all of those threads that sort of come together.
Definitely. I'm less shocked now that I know more information about the industry and how it works. But at the start, I definitely was just appalled by how incestuous the industry is. Like, I really started getting into the research that I do when I first started reflecting on my experience. And I just kind of wanted to understand more of how these programs came about. So I knew that the two programs I attended were connected in kind of a weird way, and I kind of just wanted to learn more about that. So the first program I went to was owned by Aspen Education Group, which was a company that it was pretty much at the forefront of the troubled teen industry throughout the late 90s and early 2000s. It's pretty much dissolved at this point, but the first program that I went to was owned by Aspen, and then the second program that I went to was owned by a company called Family Help and Wellness. And what I learned while I was at the second program was that the first program I went to, a few days after I left, was sold and reopened under Family Help and Wellness. So it was open under a new name. And that just really struck me as weird, of the fact that it was completely rebranded and then it was also owned by this company that owns the program that I was in at that point. And the more I learned about it, the more I realized that the founder of Family Help and Wellness, Tim Duppel, he was the former executive vice president and CFO of Aspen Education Group for many years. And so basically what Family Help and Wellness has done is buy all these programs that were previously owned by Aspen and rebranded them under their own name. But the staff that work there and the actual meat of the program is largely, if not entirely, the identical. Like, that was kind of what sparked my interest in it. And the more I started researching other programs, the more I realized that this was happening all the time. If one program gets shut down, it's either rebranded or all of the staff leave and create another program that's nearly identical, but they claim to have no affiliation with the old programs. It is shocking to me still, but I think it has gotten a little easier to deal with, because it helps to know, like, for example, if I'm researching a program, and I know you've spoken about CEDU on your podcast before. If I'm researching a program and I'm saying, wow, a lot of what I'm reading from people, this sounds a lot like, stuff that was going on at CEDU. They have a lot of the same language and the program sounds the same. Being able to search staff's names that work at that program and seeing their background. Oh, look, what do you know? They worked at CEDU High School for many years and then they founded this program. So that's actually my favorite part of doing the wiki pages that I do, because it's very satisfying to be able to connect those links and see where one person started and where they are now and what they've learned along the way that they're bringing to this program. It's really, really interesting. It feels like investigation, like real, like
I feel like it is. It's like one of those big maps with the red string and you're kind of connecting all of the dots. And I know that a lot of the time this rebranding happens because of allegations of abuse or neglect or misconduct. But actually, the majority of the time, even though these things are happening within these programs, it's because of permits that the school or program moves to the next state or a few states over. Do you think that that's quite a fair thing to say, that it's usually because of permits and not because of the things that are happening inside the programs?
It definitely does happen. I think a lot of programs that move states and things like that, a lot of those tend to make that shift after allegations have also come out and they're under a little bit more scrutiny from maybe their licensing body or the media in that state. So it's kind of easier at that point to just move to another state. Definitely a lot of the programs, though, I would say scrutiny is pretty much what drives the rebranding and moving to other places, especially now. It wasn't as big in the early 2000s, but now with how accessible the internet is and social media, especially, it's harder for these programs to do the same things that they were doing even 10 years ago without kind of having more of a harsher criticism from the public when things do come out. A lot of it is covered up and the media doesn't care a whole lot about a lot of the things that have been happening in this industry. It's really only when there's a headline story, like, somebody dies, and that really tends to make the news. But a lot of the like quieter things, even lawsuits, really don't make headlines usually.
And as we've discussed in depth across different episodes where we've covered the troubled teen industry, there's probably some chance that that is by design, considering the amount of various industries that profit and benefit off of the backs of the troubled teen industry existing. We've talked about therapists, we've talked about educational consultants, we've talked about courtrooms and judges and all different types of people that might refer or encourage a child or parent to send a child to one of these places. But whitewashing on the internet seems to be another thing that kind of happens with these programs when they rebrand as well. So you do kind of have to do some digging to find whether the program has existed with another name, under another logo, under a different company. So I suppose you've probably got quite adept at that at this point.
Definitely more than I was when I first started. It's definitely difficult to find, but what I've learned is that you can't trust the programs when, on Google reviews, for example, somebody's saying, I went to this program 20 years ago when it was called this, and then they respond and they're like, we have no affiliation with that program. Sorry. That is just a complete lie. And they know it, but they don't want to be associated with what the program was called before, because usually there's a lot of bad media about that, or people have just kind of grown to understand that that program was awful. For example, the first program I went to after it was rebranded, I saw a lot of comments on Google reviews and Yelp and stuff saying, oh, I went here when it was called this, it's terrible, and they respond, we don't have any affiliation, we're not that program. And yet I go on their page and I recognize 90% of the staff members that are still working there. And I actually requested my records and they came to me with the new name on them. So they still have the records from all of us who were there before the rebrand, and they've just popped the new name on it. And, it's you can't trust these programs to hold themselves accountable. They really don't do that. And I'm glad that we have so many people on the internet who are now doing that for them and saying, no, I know this is the same program. I recognize all of you. Most of them, you can actually find that in their business licenses. Like I've found quite a few programs where if you go through and look for their business licenses, it literally will have records of the name change and the same license. They've just changed the name.
That's dodgy, that, isn't it?
I
And
know.
with some of the Yelp reviews as well, there's been instances where some of the programs have managed to actually get some of the negative reviews removed from their Yelp page. So various individuals that have been impacted or victimized by one of these programs goes back to the Yelp page and says, seeing as you've managed to get my 1-star review removed, here it is again for anybody that's considering sending their child to this awful place. My most recent observation of that taking place was on the Maple Lake Academy Yelp review page, where a number of 1-star reviews had been removed, mostly regarding an individual's experience being sexually assaulted, well, raped, which is obviously it's an uncomfortable word to use, so I do apologize. And I will put trigger warnings at the start of this episode. And she's had to repeatedly go back to this Yelp review page and write this story out because somehow that review keeps disappearing from the page. So I'm sure you come across this type of thing all of the time.
Yep. There's actually a company called RTC Defenders, which is a reputation management company, is how it describes itself. And treatment centers, therapeutic boarding schools, other programs in the troubled teen industry can hire RTC Defenders to pretty much scrub the internet for them and take away negative reviews, bury them. I've found multiple instances of programs that use companies like RTC Defenders who have so many fake reviews posted that they can't even keep track. And some of them are the exact same reviews copied and pasted just under different fake accounts. It's really crazy the lengths that these programs will go to cover up the abuse instead of actually trying to make changes and work on their program and make it not abusive. Yeah, I would highly recommend looking into RTC Defenders. I know of several companies that are using them actively, and that's why they have, all these reviews that are getting deleted.
I had absolutely no idea. I know that people can create bots that will promote posts or pictures or whatever across multiple platforms or interact with any social media account that uses a specific word or tag. We know that it happens with things like Scientology. We know that there are big, massive groups out there that have these huge legal teams and these huge budgets for PR. And I just didn't realize that the troubled teen industry were accessing that strategy at such a high level. I mean, it makes sense.
Yep, definitely. I think it's recently become a thing because of all the publicity that the troubled teen industry has gotten in the last couple years. There wasn't really a need for it like 10 years ago because people really weren't speaking about the experience very openly. Like there were a couple web forums, but a few negative reviews on Google or whatever, but not to the scale that it's happening now. So it's very unsurprising that a company like this exists, but it's really infuriating to me. It reminds me of this time actually that I think this was about 4 or so years after I left my second program. I got an email from my old therapist and he sent it to me and a bunch of other former residents who I guess he thought liked the experience and would defend the program, basically asking us to leave a bunch of 5-star reviews because they had recently gotten a bad review from somebody who was saying that one of the therapists had sexually assaulted her. And he basically sent us this long email asking us to bury it and, leaving 5-star reviews and telling other people who had good experiences to also leave 5-star reviews and our parents. And I obviously didn't, but I noticed, I kept checking the reviews after that. And I noticed that, there were 25 5-star reviews all posted in the span of 2 or 3 days. And I've noticed that more and more researching other programs of there'll be a bad review and then in the next couple days there's 20 more 5-star reviews, all from people, I don't know if they're real or not, but all different people just leaving 5-star reviews spontaneously. So I'm guessing that that's a practice that happens in a lot of other programs as well.
Well, I see it sometimes with aggressive targeted ads when you Google something and then your whole social media and everything is filled with, do you need this kettle? Do you want this kettle? And then all of the comments on that post will be, oh, I was unsure about this product, but now it's the best thing I've ever purchased in my life. 5 out of 5, highly recommend.
Yep.
And they're just all bot accounts leaving the same generic review, but it really does have that consumer marketing impact on the individual when they're like, wow, I really did need a kettle and everyone's saying this one's great, so I'll just buy it now.
Definitely.
Oh my goodness. And you got in touch with me initially to point out some links between the troubled teen industry and the LDS Church after I had a conversation with Courtney, who came to talk to me about her experiences in the LDS Church in episode 142. And I wondered if you could talk the listeners through some of these links regarding the Mormon faith and Synanon and the troubled teen industry and notable people from history who have been involved in allowing all of these things to exist.
Definitely. Yeah. It was definitely a culture shock for me going from California to Utah. I knew very few Mormons growing up, and I actually spent the ages of 11 to 15 living in another country. So by the time I came back, I didn't understand that Utah was such a Mormon state and that that's kind of the center of that religion. I really didn't know much about Mormonism. I remember one of the staff telling me she was LDS, and I was like, I don't know what that is. And I really had no clue about it. And the more that I have looked into it, the more I realize that Utah and Mormons are really the pioneers of this industry. Part of the reason so many of these programs are located in Utah is because Utah has historically really underregulated the industry. So it's easiest to create programs and maintain programs in that state without having to worry about oversight. The industry really kind of started in Utah to a large extent. I mean, obviously, CEDU was one of the first programs, and that was not affiliated with Mormons at all. But basically, the first connection that I found was actually to Synanon. So Brigham Young University, which is the college funded by the LDS Church, it's one of the largest contributors of people to the troubled teen industry. Many staff go to BYU, come from it. And Chuck Diederich actually enlisted the help of a BYU graduate to set up a Synanon chapter in San Diego back in the 60s, I think. So that was kind of the first connection that I found between the troubled teen industry and Mormons. But the more that I looked into it, I actually found out that the first kind of wilderness program, the way that we think of them today, was created by a man named Larry Dean Olson, who was a BYU professor. And he basically started leading these outdoor survival classes for students at BYU who were struggling academically. And they found they actually helped these students kind of get back into their academics and succeed. So they started really offering those regularly. And Larry Dean Olson eventually left and created a program called the Anasazi Foundation, which is still in operation today. That was kind of one of the first wilderness programs, the way that we think of them today. And a lot of the programs that exist now and have existed were really inspired by that. There was also a BYU dropout named Steve Cardasano, who basically was inspired by Olson's courses. And in the 1980s, he created a program called the Challenger Foundation, which is another one of the very first wilderness programs. And that program was shut down after, I believe, a student died there. But the staff members went on to create a bunch of other programs, and you can kind of see how it's like a tree, these are the trunks, and then everything else just sprouts off, branches off. Another reason that I think that Mormons and the troubled teen industry are so intertwined as well is because of their political influence, especially in Utah. Mitt Romney, who is a very active Mormon graduate of BYU, he actually profited off of this industry for many years through his company Bain Capital. It purchased Aspen Education Group in 2006, and that when I learned about that, that's when I really realized how insane this entire industry is and how difficult it's going to be to fight just because of the political connections to that. And there's actually even more connections between Mitt Romney and other programs, which is insane. During his 2008 presidential campaign, he appointed Mel Sembler to be his national finance co-chairman. And Mel Sembler was the founder of Straight Incorporated, which was one of the first troubled teen programs and one of the most notorious ones. It was horrible. And he also appointed somebody named Robert Litchfield, who was the founder of the Worldwide Association of Specialty Programs in Schools, or WASP, which is another one of the most notorious companies within the troubled teen industry. He appointed Robert Litchfield to be on his Utah Finance Committee. So that actually ended up getting Mitt Romney in some trouble because that was around the time that WASP was being investigated and many of their programs are being shut down by the authorities. So that kind of drew some scrutiny to Mitt Romney about that. But he is clearly linked in with a lot of different people, especially in Utah, but also just throughout the country who are involved in the troubled teen industry. He also, I believe it's Rick Santorum, he is currently on the board of directors or just on the board of Universal Health Services, which is another large provider. It's the company that owns Provo Canyon School and bought a lot of CEDU programs after CEDU collapsed. So there's a lot of political connections between Mormons and the troubled teen industry as well. And I think one of the kind of cultural reasons around it is that in this country, and I'm sure throughout the world, I mean, Mormons are definitely most prevalent in the United States, but throughout the country, Mormons are kind of seen as very wholesome, morally upstanding, religious people, and seems like the perfect kind of people to send your troubled child to go stay with and, have them be healed. But it's hard for a lot of people to believe that Mormons could also be perpetuating so much of this abuse and the things that are coming out. I think I was not raised in a religious household. My parents, my mom is Christian and my dad is Jewish. So I wasn't really raised with organized religion. So I think their kind of cultural perception around Mormons was something that drew them to want to send me to Utah, just because they, seem like good people from the outside looking in. And they didn't know that the programs I went to were not marketed as religious, but they definitely had a lot of Mormon influence in them, just from things like the dress code and the things they expected from us to also the things that they told us about how the things we had done in the past were wrong, things like that. It was very influenced by the Mormon religion. And I don't think my parents totally knew that when they were sending me away.
Do you think that these programs are also running with the agenda of being some type of conversion or recruitment mill as well for individuals that don't tie themselves to the Mormon faith?
Definitely. The programs I went to they didn't make an effort to convert us really, but they were clearly favoring the girls who were already Mormon or were interested in being a Mormon, becoming a Mormon. I remember, as I said, I'm not religious, but when I was at the program, I was very desperate, and I thought, maybe if I met with a rabbi or something, I could find God and he'll help me through this or whatever. And I asked if I could see a rabbi, and they were like, we don't do that, but you can meet with a Mormon bishop. And I was like, I'm good. Never mind then. Yeah, it was definitely, I noticed a lot of the people that I went to these programs with ended up staying in Utah afterwards, and some of them converted. And I've, read a lot of testimonies from people saying they tried to convert me, or they made us attend this church, their church, and tried to get us baptized and things like that. It definitely goes along with the Mormon philosophy of missions and trying to get recruits and, modern colonization of these, countries and trying to get people to become Mormons. So it kind of goes along with that.
It's interesting when we think about how the amendments in America mean that you can't have a religious state, but that seems to be what happens in Utah. In the documentary Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey that came out recently on Netflix, there were police officers who were telling news reporters and investigators to take a step back and to stop investigating the child marriages and the polygamy, which is illegal, that was taking place. And people were told to just ignore it and to leave. And then, of course, there was this scandal where there was a member of law enforcement who was picked up and arrested for having a child bride.
Yep.
Just shows you the lengths that the community will go to not only protect what they believe is their fundamental religious right, but also that they don't believe anybody outside of that system has any credence or say over how they run their lives. So it makes you wonder if that is the same with programs that are Mormon-based in Utah.
Yep.
Is it because it's such a self-sealed system and it's all Mormon individuals and LDS individuals involved in these programs that nobody on the outside steps in to see if they're doing things the way that they should be?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, another podcast called Sent Away that came out recently, they kind of went through, they requested, the people who created that worked for the Salt Lake Tribune, and they went to the DHS in Utah and asked for all of the records that they had on all of these programs. And when they looked through all of the inspection reports and things like that, they noticed that pretty much all of these programs were getting pretty like 100%. And that is not, like, they compared it to, you know, an entire stack of A+, you know, test scores like that. It's clear that the Office of Licensing and the DHS in Utah were not doing their job. And I don't know if it's just because they didn't know what was actually going on, or if there was a religious, you know, something religious and cultural happening there. But it seems to be mainly an issue in Utah, and a few other states. But even outside of Utah, the programs that I've seen, a lot of them are run by Mormons, even if they're outside of Utah. It's really crazy just how intertwined everything is with the LDS faith.
It feels almost as if people outside of the area and outside of the faith are kind of just letting the Mormon faith get on with things, whether it's the LDS Church or the FLDS Church.
Yep.
And like you said, it was only when this headline came out that they started to investigate Warren Jeffs himself. And that's when he became part of, you know, the FBI's most wanted list. And I'm sure that it's the same with the troubled teen industry, but it would be difficult to pinpoint who outside of it knows exactly how much and to what extent.
Definitely.
You mentioned something before about Synanon and Sea-Doo. People I've spoken to, some people say that the troubled teen industry was born from Synanon and the practices that happened in Charles Diedrich's 1960s drug rehabilitation cult. They had scream therapy, attack therapy, and a lot of these people involved in Synanon went on to create Sea-Doo. And then, as you've explained there, it wasn't just Sea-Doo that existed, but Straight Inc. Some people say that it was Synanon that birthed the troubled teen industry. Have you found that Synanon impacted the troubled teen industry?
I definitely feel like I definitely see both sides. For me, I personally feel that Synanon inspired the troubled teen industry. If you look at a lot of the early programs, I mean, Sea-Doo is one of the first modern troubled teen programs, and it was almost a direct copy of Synanon in the beginning. Other programs, like the Elan School up here in Maine, that program was created by somebody who went to a direct spin-off of Synanon called Daytop Village. Yeah, which just so I think more so Synanon definitely inspired a lot of these programs and created what we think of as the troubled teen industry these days. But Synanon wasn't in and of itself a troubled teen program, in my opinion, except it did have the Punk Squad, which was, you know, kids who were sent to this to Synanon against their will. And that did use a lot of the same tactics that troubled teen industry programs use, but they're definitely intertwined. And I think CEDU, the fact that CEDU then inspired so many other programs. I mean, in my opinion, CEDU was the precursor to Aspen Education Group. Many of the early Aspen Education Group programs were created by CEDU staff and were pretty much a direct copy of CEDU. And that kind of gave birth to the Aspen Education Group. So you can draw these links directly back to Synanon if you go back far enough for most programs.
I think that's interesting because when people discuss infamous or notorious cults throughout history, Synanon is one of those groups that will be up there. And there are other programs that we've discussed on the show that have religious ties and affiliations. Tyler spoke to us about their experience in Teen Challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm actually coming to recognize now that there are many different groups that have a religious syllabus or religious teachings where the Bible lessons will actually take priority over any type of formal education, which we know is already lacking inside these programs as it is. Are there any others off the top of your head that you can think of that have these religious ties?
Yeah, there definitely are. One of the ones that comes to mind are the roll-off homes, which they're places like the Rebecca Home for Girls and the Anchor Home for Boys, which is still open under the name Anchor Academy now. But those programs were created, I think they are Baptist based. Lester Roloff, I think, was a Baptist minister, and he created a bunch of these horrific homes for teenagers that have long and well substantiated histories of abuse. And some of them are still open, just rebranded and, kind of cut affiliation with Lester Roloff himself. But one of the most I think the reason that there are so many religious programs as well is that in a lot of states, religious programs do not need to be licensed in the same way that they would require a mental health facility or a boarding school to be licensed. If it's religious, they can skirt a lot of that licensing requirements. And for that reason, we have a ton of unlicensed, unregulated, religious boarding schools for teenagers, and parents send their kids there. It's just mind-blowing to me, but that has been changing in the last couple years in some states, but there's still so many that they're just able to operate freely without any oversight whatsoever.
The conversion and recruitment side of the programs and the religious doctrine that is put onto the individuals that are being forced to take these programs, it's kind of akin to MLM programs, multi-level marketing programs that we've heard about on the show, but on different documentaries as well. We know that LuLaRoe is created by two people that are Mormons. I don't think that they identify as severely as they did when they first founded LuLaRoe. But even talking about Amway and the episode that we did on the show where the individual was told by her church group that she had to not only sell Amway products, but also recruit and convert individuals to the church who would then be told to go and sell Amway products. It kind of feels that these programs do the same thing in the sense that they recruit and convert individuals to the various faiths that they align with, but they also then recruit and convert the people that take part in the programs to stay on as staff members. And so when these other programs start up, it's actually a lot of individuals who have been through these programs that end up becoming the staff that are on the payroll. Would you say that that's a fair analysis?
Definitely, yeah. That happens so often in these programs. And part of it is because a lot of these programs don't require the staff to have anything more than a GED and a driver's license. When I was at these programs, most of the staff that we spent the majority of our time with were 20, 21, 22, either just out of high school or in the process of getting their undergraduate degree. And I just want to say, too, another interesting connection between MLMs and the troubled teen industry. The founder of Herbalife went to CEDU, and he got his training, with recruiting people and selling stuff by selling CEDU basically to parents. He would go around advertising for them and trying to raise money.
I had absolutely no idea. That wasn't even in my question list. It was just something that came to my mind when we were talking about how some of the faith-based groups might use their environment to kind of further the religious agenda. That is wild, isn't it?
Yeah, no, and they definitely target the same types of people, MLMs, in the troubled teen industry. It's people who are looking for something, and they're being sold something that's completely different than what they're actually getting.
Wow. And I'm really, really enjoying getting your perspective on all of these things that you've managed to tie together and learn through your investigative work. But now I would like to turn the conversation to your personal experiences, if that's okay. So you've mentioned that the first program you went to was the Aspen Institute. I just wondered if you could talk to us about how it was that your parents decided to send you there. How were they approached? How were you taken and transported there? We know that's a big part of people's experiences in the troubled teen industry. Mm-hmm. What the Aspen Institute was like when you first arrived, your first impressions, and then your time throughout the program.
Sure. Yeah, so I definitely was not like a defiant kid. I just dealt with a lot of anxiety. I was pretty much born anxious, and it got a lot worse when I hit puberty. My family moved to Australia when I was 11, and we spent 4 years there. So when I came back, I was very different. I was a 15-year-old, and I had seen all these people the last time when I was 11. So that was a huge adjustment. And then also when I was in Australia, I had some pretty bad things happen to me. I was assaulted, and that kind of sent me into a downward spiral of depression, and I was self-harming. And when I returned to America, when we moved back, my mom, one of the first things she wanted me to do was see a psychiatrist, because the mental health stuff in Australia is terrible. It took us like months just to see a psychiatrist, and they don't have any. The therapists had long wait lists, and it was just really, really lacking. So when I got back, one of the first things they wanted me to do was see a psychiatrist, and I didn't realize that if I told the psychiatrist that I was probably going to self-harm, when I got home, that meant that I had to be involuntarily committed to a hospital. So that's basically what happened. Only a few days after I moved back, I was put in the psych ward. And while I was there, I was put on so many different medications. Like, I don't remember the total number. I have a list somewhere that my mom was keeping for a while, but I was on like 6 or 7 different psychiatric medications, some of which were just to, deal with the side effects of other psychiatric meds. And I became pretty much a zombie. I had no energy. I gained a lot of weight. I was always hungry. I actually lost my vision, which was interesting. I had to wear glasses for the first and only time in my life. I don't know which medication that was, but yeah. And I also lost my memory for a lot of that. There's about a 4-month period of my life that I just have no memory of, like, at all. So I was obviously not doing well after I got out of the psych ward. I attempted to go back to the high school in my town, but I really couldn't do it. I was too anxious. I would break down every day, and I only really went to school a couple days before I realized that it wasn't going to happen. So I stopped going to school. I was getting homeschooled by the teachers from my school who would come to my house afterwards, after the day, and would teach me some lessons, but I wasn't in any space to learn. I was still extremely depressed and kind of just spiraling. So I understand why my parents were scared. They were very concerned that I was going to kill myself, which I don't think I would have done, but I was in a really bad space, and I was self-harming pretty much every day. So I understand why they were really scared. I ended up getting taken to the psych ward again, of I think 4 months after my first visit. And on that time was when they the hospital recommended my parents find an educational consultant and put me in a longer term facility, which I had no idea about. I thought I was just going to be in the psych ward for a couple weeks and then come back. And that's kind of, I didn't realize that there was another option. So when my parents, they hired this educational consultant and he recommended the Aspen Institute. I didn't know that they had hired this man. I had never spoken with him or met him. They come into the hospital and they visit me and they basically say, all right, so, we think it's best that you're going to be going to a program in Utah for a month. And I was pissed. I was so upset. I was screaming at them. I actually threw a chair at the social worker, which, I mean, I'm not a violent person at all, and I've never done anything like that before, but that kind of conveys how just like desperate I was to not be sent to this place. And this is before I knew anything about the troubled teen industry. I thought this was going to be like a hospital like the one I was in, which was pretty nice. I don't really have any issues with the psych ward that I was in. It was way better than anything I went to in Utah, but I was really upset, and I was writing them all these letters and trying to convince them not to send me, and that obviously didn't happen. So I didn't know when I was leaving, but in the middle of the night, a couple days later, I was woken up in my hospital room to two large strangers who were standing in the doorway and basically told me that they were going to be taking me to Utah. They did the whole, do this the easy way or the hard way thing. And I was on so many medications. I was like a total zombie. So I just complied. I didn't know that that was going to happen. I kind of thought that my parents were going to take me, but that was definitely shocking. But the actual transport, I slept for most of the time. It's a pretty quick flight to Utah. So I pretty much slept the entire flight. And then we arrived and they drove me to the Aspen Institute. And I was under the impression that I was only going to be there for like a month at most. And when I got there, I realized that it was going to be much longer. The first thing I noticed and that kind of tipped me off to this place not being what I thought it was going to be was literally as soon as I arrived. Immediately after I got there, they took me through this giant metal door that had like 6 locks on it. It was a lockdown facility. They took me into a bathroom with 2 staff members and they told me that I needed to take my clothes off. And I had never been in a situation like that before. At the psych ward, what they do is they give you a hospital gown and they take you into a private room by yourself and they say, okay, take off all your clothes and put this gown on and then knock when you're ready for me to come back in. And then they run like a metal detector over you. So they never see you naked and it's still just as safe. But here I was, this 15-year-old kid in a new state with 2 strangers telling me that I needed to take my clothes off. I started crying and telling them that, I had a history of sexual assault. I really didn't feel comfortable. Was there another way they could do this? And I don't remember the exact language they used, but the gist of it was, you're going to take your clothes off or we're going to take them off for you. Ugh. So I actually didn't even realize I was supposed to take my underwear off until I took all my clothes off. And then they were like, no, the underwear too. And it was the most humiliating experience of my life. You had to stand there for like 20 minutes after that while they have this like outline of a body that looks like what coroners use. They had that and they were marking every single detail on my body, my acne, my scars, cuts, bruises, things like that.
That is a huge red flag. That is like they're doing body marking. It's what you would do when you work in health and social care. Mm-hmm. And if somebody gets a bruise or a cut on themselves and you have to document it on one of those outlines of a human body, that's for accountability purposes. So if somebody was to come and visit you and you had a mark on you, they'd go back to that chart and say, oh no, she had that on arrival. That's disgusting.
Yep. Yeah, no, it was very shocking. And I didn't realize that because I had had a history of self-harm, I actually had to get those body checks done like 3 times a week for my whole stay there. And a lot of the time they were by male staff, which made me even more uncomfortable. And they would always give me the excuse of, oh no, I'm a medical professional, it's fine. And it's like, well, you're supposed to be helping me and I have trauma around being naked in front of men I don't know. And also it's just nobody wants to do that. No 15-year-old girl is like wanting to get completely naked in front of strange men that they barely know, but they didn't care. And that was it. I definitely kind of became numb to it after a while, but I noticed after I got out, it still makes me very uncomfortable being naked around pretty much anybody. That was kind of my first introduction to the troubled teen industry. And that's kind of when I realized that this place wasn't the place that I thought it was. And it's probably not the place my parents thought it was either, because if they knew what was going on there, they would have come and picked me up immediately. The Aspen Institute, there were just so many weird rules there. It was a lockdown facility, so every door was locked. You had to get permission to get the door unlocked to go to the bathroom. And then a staff had to wait outside while you used the bathroom. And the way the bathroom was set up was it was this big room that had 2 shower stalls on one side and then 2 toilets that were in stalls with like swinging doors that didn't lock. And the staff would stand right outside of that swinging door. That the door did not even come close to the ceiling, so they could see over it. So it was just a really invasive experience, and a couple staff would kind of power trip about that and, you know, be making comments while you're on the toilet and things like that. It was just very uncomfortable the whole time. We had to get patted down every time we walked into or out of a room by staff members. We would all stand in a line and they just go through and pat us all down. Like, what are we going to be taking out of any of these rooms? There's nothing like.
Well, you arrived from a facility in the first place. So where you've already said, you know, for your own safety, you had to go through these checks. So why you're being strip searched, I don't understand. It didn't pick you up from your home in the middle of the night.
Exactly. Like, I was in a psych ward and then I came immediately with transporters through an airport and then immediately here. Like, I don't have anything on me. But that was like a constant thing. We just always had to get patted down and the body checks, and we weren't allowed to wear shoes, which was weird. They took all of our shoes because we didn't really go outside anyway. I developed a severe vitamin D deficiency while I was there and had to start taking tablets for that. It was just a very controlling environment, and you were constantly being watched. The first night that I was at the Aspen Institute, I was on level 1, which you got a level every day there, depending on how you behaved the previous day. But the first week or so that you're there, you're on the lowest level and you can't even sleep in your room. I had to sleep in the hallway on a mattress just on the floor, which they don't really turn the lights off. So it was really rough having to sleep out there. And there were people who were on level 1 for like months, or like for their whole stay. So that was pretty much, they didn't have a room. Like, they just slept in the hallway every night. One of the worst things at the Aspen Institute was they had, I forget what they called it exactly. I think it was either the seclusion room or the timeout room or something along those lines. I actually didn't know that they had that until I saw it being used. It was the door right across the hallway from my room. And one night there was a girl who had really severe issues, like more than I think a place like this was set to deal with, like psychosis kind of stuff. And she had a really rough life, and I felt really bad for her. She didn't belong. I mean, none of us belonged in a place like this, but she was clearly not getting the help she needed. She was screaming and crying because she missed her family and wanted to go home. And they restrained her in the hallway and then dragged her into that room, which I didn't even know what it was at the time, but they were unlocking it, and it had no windows. It had one tiny little window that was like 6 feet off the ground, so staff could look in and check. But they threw her in that room and left her there, and you could hear her like banging her head against the walls. And by the time she came out, she had like blood literally all over her face, and her face was so swollen from crying and screaming. And it was like, that's one of the things from the Aspen Institute that really still haunts me. They didn't use it often, but when they did use it, it was just horrible. And it was something that impacted all of us who saw that happen. So as soon as I saw that happening, I was like, I'm never acting out in here. I'm going to do whatever they say. I'm going to be on my best behavior. I want to go home. And I found out later that room, basically all that was in there was a drain and concrete on the floor and then white tiles on the walls. And that was it. No furniture or anything. That's just all it was. And yeah, I saw probably 4 or 5 kids be put in there throughout the almost 3 months that I was at Aspen. And I think Viewpoint still uses it. The Aspen Institute is now called Viewpoint Center in the same building and everything. But I've heard from people who went to the program when it was called Viewpoint that they still use that seclusion room, which is just horrific to me. Yeah, that kind of sums up a lot of the stuff. There is one story that I want to share because I remembered this recently, actually, earlier this year, and I think it kind of sums up just the sadistic nature of this program. One night, well, early in the morning, we were woken up by the fire alarms going off at like 5 a.m, which I thought it was a fire drill or something, which is fine, but the staff came running down all of our halls and yelling, "There's a tornado coming at us. There's a tornado coming at us. You have to get out right now." And they're screaming at us, like, seemed very real. I had never lived in a place where tornadoes happen, so I was terrified. I didn't know anything about tornadoes pretty much, and I was picturing this massive tornado coming right at our building. They were yelling, "It's coming right at us. It's gonna, rip this whole place up. We got to get out, pack your stuff up." And so we were all packing our stuff. A lot of people in that program had horrible anxiety disorders, myself included. So there were a lot of people having panic attacks and crying and like screaming. I thought I was never going to see my parents again. I really thought I was going to die. And right as soon as they're about to unlock it, they all turn around and they go, "April Fools." And it was all just, which none of us knew what day or time it was. Like, nobody knew it was April Fool's Day. No, like, what kind of sick joke is that to play on a bunch of like children with like mental health issues to like basically tell them that they're all gonna die? And then we just had to resume as normal and pretend that nothing like that happened. So that was one of those things that I remembered recently and was just like, oh my God, like, everything I thought I remembered about this program, it just keeps getting worse and worse. Yeah, it was just a really messed up place. And I was there for about 2.5 months. And I thought I was going to be going home afterwards, but obviously that didn't happen because they don't recommend that anybody goes home after that. It's pretty much a holding cell until they can get you into a longer term program. It's what I've kind of learned about it.
It feels like as soon as you're in that referral process, you're then kind of kept within the industry for as long as possible. And it seems typical that most individuals, as you explained, you thought you were only going for a few weeks, but you actually end up staying for a long time, or you end up staying for a few weeks and then you're transported to another longer term program where the average stay is, I say in air quotes, the average stay is 12 months, but most people end up staying for like 18 months because, of course,
Yep.
Every single month that you're there, they get more money.
Mm-hmm.
What you've mentioned there about that, the actual holding cell in the building is heartbreaking. That individual clearly needed so much help.
I know. That's one of those things that like haunts me still. And I wish that there was a way for me to find that girl and see how she's doing now, but we weren't allowed to know each other's last names or anything. So I just hope she's doing all right now and that she knows that what happened to her wasn't her fault.
If you think about the justice system and you assume that when it works correctly, as it should do, but doesn't always, people that are found guilty of their crimes that are punishable by prison time, they go to prison. And within these prisons, which is already your form of punishment, if you can't adhere to the prison rules, you'll be put into solitary confinement. These are children that have been sent to these treatment centres and programs to be helped. How is that helping any child?
It's insane. I mean, learning that solitary confinement has actually been banned in juvenile prisons and juvenile detention centers, but it still happens in these private troubled teen programs. It's just insane to me that they keep getting away with this. And this was, I mean, I was sent to the Aspen Institute in 2014, like that, really not that long ago. And I know that this stuff is still happening in so many other programs throughout the country. It's heartbreaking. It's part of why I do what I do, because I really just want to see this industry burn.
So you're here in this program for around 2.5 months, and you said it's just a holding program until you got transferred to a longer term program, which I'm eager to talk about. But I wondered if you could just tell us what the day-to-day program was like at Aspen Institute in terms of, what activities would they run? Was there some type of therapy? Was there some type of group activity?
Yeah, it was a very boring program, I will say. There wasn't a whole lot to do. It was basically you wake up, have breakfast, and then on the weekdays we would have quote unquote school, which was not school. Basically, we would sit in this room with this guy who said he was a teacher, and he would play episodes of Star Trek or whatever, and we would just watch that. And at the end of every week, we had a homework assignment that was basically an art project. It was not school. The Aspen Institute, the purpose that it said it did for parents was it was a behavioral assessment center. So they would do comprehensive psychiatric evaluation of you. That I actually have a copy of mine, and it is just riddled with all of these crazy lies that they made up about me. It's really insane to see that and just know that my parents read that, and that was why they decided I needed to go to a long-term program. There was just a lot of really blatantly made up things in that about my history and things that I know I never said to them that they're, but they're in the evaluation, so my parents believe them. Anyway, I'm getting off topic, but after school, we would, I think, have like room time where we were just like in our rooms for like 30 minutes. If you were on a high enough level, if you were on level 1, you had to sit in the hallway during that time. And then I think we usually had some sort of like therapeutic group, which was pretty much just people saying like how they were feeling and just talking about it. And then some days, if you were on level 2 or 3, they would take us right across the like this little pathway to Island View, which is another troubled teen program owned by Aspen Education Group. It's also now rebranded as Elevations RTC under Family Help and Wellness. So the Aspen Institute was like a branch of Island View, basically. Like the kids at Island View called it the psych ward because it was like a lockdown version of Island View a little bit. And they would take us to the gym at Island View some days, and we could like play dodgeball for an hour or something like that. And then we would come back and eat dinner and go to sleep, shower and go to sleep. It was super mundane. We did have therapy. My old therapist at the Aspen Institute is now the clinical director of Viewpoint, so she's still there. And my therapy sessions were pretty much me just like trying to see if she was going to recommend my parents to send me to a longer program or not, and trying to convince her that I wanted to go home and that I needed to go home, which I think that might have worked against me. But yeah, that was pretty much the day to day. And then your last couple weeks there is when they start doing the like psychiatric evaluation. So basically for that, they just pull you at random times in the day to go and like do a test or two, and then they, drop you back off and you can rejoin the group. But that was pretty much it. We sometimes got to go outside into this little like fenced in yard area that had like a 10-foot high chain link fence around it, and we could just kind of go outside and like sit there for like 30 minutes a day.
It sounds like actual prison.
It really felt like it. Like, I remembered thinking several times there, like, why am I in like a jail-like setting? I didn't do anything bad. Like, I was just a mentally ill teenager and I'm being treated like a prisoner. Yeah, it was a really weird time.
So the recommendation is that you attend a longer term program. Your parents have sent all of these notes and evaluations of these impromptu sessions that you've been called into. So there, at least, if your parents were to say, did you have these sessions? Then you'd say, yeah, I had sessions. But then, they're like, oh, okay, so she did have sessions. But the conclusions of those sessions aren't entirely accurate. So based on that, your parents agree for you to go on to a second program. How does this happen? I guess there's kind of like the whole set of questions again in terms of how are you transported there? How far away is it? the name of the program, your first impressions, the day-to-day, notable events that happened there, and the set of conditions that individuals are expected to exist in when they're at this program?
Yeah, so basically, once Aspen recommended that I go to a longer term program, my parents got back in touch with my educational consultant, and he sent my mom over a list of like, I think 3 or 4 programs. And my mom flew out to Utah and visited them, and she liked Solstice the best. So that was where I ended up. The day that I found out that I was going to a longer term program was like probably in my top 3 worst days of my entire life. I can't even describe the feelings that I was having, but it was just like I felt completely powerless and like my life was ending. I really felt so trapped and helpless, and I just had no motivation to do anything at that point. I felt like my parents didn't trust me and they didn't want me, and it was really a horrible day. I eventually kind of accepted that I was going to be going to a longer program. And a few days later, I was picked up at the Aspen Institute by 2 staff at Solstice who, funnily enough, it turns out that Solstice is actually located only about 5 miles away from the Aspen Institute, and it's actually on the same road. So it's like a straight shot just down the exact same road. So it was like a 7-minute drive. And they picked me up and they did my intake at Solstice, which was pretty much the same routine as at Aspen, with they took us into the nurses station with 2 staff and did the strip search again, which at that point I was kind of used to. So I didn't really even bat an eye about it because I had been getting that done 3 times a week for the last 2 months. So they did my intake and I was assigned a big sister who was this really awesome girl. I honestly loved her. She really made me feel a lot more comfortable in the program at the start, at least. And I could tell she was trying to be comforting, and that she didn't really totally believe the things that she was telling me about, it's not that bad. It's a nice place. They really care about you. But you could kind of tell that she didn't totally mean that. I was put on summer team. So Solstice divides the residents. When I was there, I think they have 4 teams now, but when I was there was summer team, winter team, and autumn team. So I think they also have a spring team now, but when I was there weren't enough people there for there to be 4 teams. And you're assigned that based off of your therapists. So each team had 2 therapists, and everyone on the team was assigned to one of those 2 therapists. So my therapist was this woman named Melissa, who was every time that my first day, everyone was asking, "Oh, who's your therapist? What team are you on?" And like every time I would say that it was Melissa, people were like, "Oh, I'm so sorry." Like she was known as like the worst therapist in the program, at least on summer team. She was the worst of the 2. And that really freaked me out because I was hoping that once I got into a session with her, I would start talking and she'd realize that I don't belong in this place and she'd recommend my parents to come pick me up. That was like my game plan when I got there. I was like, I don't belong here. I'm going to convince them I don't belong here. And obviously that didn't happen. My first session with Melissa, which I think happened on maybe the second day I was at Solstice, I kind of tried to convince her that I shouldn't be there and that, my issues aren't that bad and I'm ready to go home. I just spent 2 months in another program and that fixed me and I'm fine. And she was like, "Oh, you should just fly through the program then, huh?" Like just not budging whatsoever. So at that point, I kind of realized like, no, I'm stuck here and I have no way to contact my parents. I was not given the privilege of being allowed to talk to my parents until I think you have to be on the 2nd level. And at that point, it's a 5-minute phone conversation once a week, and it's monitored by staff who are listening in and can disconnect the call at any moment if you say something they don't like. So that's when it kind of sunk in that I was going to be there for a while. My parents told me that the length of stay was around 6 to 8 months. That was what the program told them. And once I got there and met my team and everyone was going around saying how long they'd been there, I realized that the majority of those people were there for, 6+ months, and they were only on the 4th level. And there were 7 levels in total. So the average length of stay was more in the realm of 12 to 18 months. And you really had to work hard to get out in 12 months. That was like pretty much unheard of.
Do you have any idea how much some people don't feel comfortable answering, but how much your parents were paying, or the average price that it cost at the time that you went to Solstice for somebody to stay for 6 months, 12 months?
So my parents didn't pay the majority of it. Our insurance my dad had really great insurance at that point, and they paid for the majority of the program, which I have mixed feelings about, because if my insurance hadn't covered it, I probably wouldn't have gone, because my parents couldn't afford to pay that. But I'm also glad that the program didn't bankrupt my parents. Like, I've read about a lot of other parents having to like take out second mortgages on their houses and stuff to afford this kind of thing. I don't know how much Solstice cost when I was there. My mom and dad just don't tell me, but they weren't paying the majority of it. But I've recently found, so Solstice has 2 locations. There's one in Utah, and then there's Solstice East in North Carolina. And I found a document that they uploaded recently that the price of it is, I think, $13,350 a month. So that equates to about $150,000 a year, which is twice as expensive as most colleges. Most expensive colleges. Like that, it was $150,000 a year.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's like a house on the road that I live on.
And that's pretty typical in these programs. Like, I've heard of programs that cost $20,000 a month. Like, they really are. I mean, it's almost ingenious. If it wasn't so evil, it's such a good idea for a profitable business. You can charge them whatever, and the actual costs of running these places are dirt cheap.
That is such a huge amount of money for your child to be sent and probably abused, for their well-being and mental health to decline even further, and for you to either be paying back your insurance, for your insurance premiums to go up, or for you to just be in a heck ton of debt.
It's really crazy to me. And I mean, it probably was a little bit less expensive in 2014, but probably not by much.
When you're a teenager, you're still kind of trying to appeal to the goodness in people, because, you're trusting and you're young and you don't have, worldly experience. So you're not thinking, wow, they really want $13,000 from me for every extra month I stay here. So you plead into your therapist, to go home, thinking, yeah, she'll definitely send me home because she'll see that that's what's best for me. You don't think to yourself, obviously she's never going to do that, because then how many thousands of dollars are they going to miss out on if they just send home every child that shouldn't be there, which is probably every single child.
Exactly. Yeah. No, and I think one of the reasons I was kept so long was also because my insurance paid for most of it, which a lot of girls would get pulled once their parents couldn't afford it anymore. But they knew that my insurance was going to keep paying for it, and they could keep me there as long as they wanted, and just kind of milk that. So I ended up being at Solstice for a little over 13 months.
Such a long time. And North Carolina, you mentioned, there seems to be another hot spot for these programs. So is that like another unregulated state?
Definitely. Yeah. It's very similar to Utah in that it's slightly more regulated, but barely. And there have been historically and are still quite a few programs in North Carolina. It's similar to Montana in that way too. Montana and Idaho are other kind of like hot spots for these. Just, it's easy to open a program there. You don't really need any certificates or degrees, and licensing is a joke. North Carolina is getting better. The DHS actually has started to step up and take notice of these programs in the last couple of years, but it's still going to take a long time before it's regulated in the way it should be.
So in your 13 months that you're at Solstice, how often are you supposed to see this therapist? And you're in this summer group as well. So are there group activities that you take part in? What does your average week look like in terms of the structure of the program?
Basically, the team structure, how that works is you spend most of your time just with that group of people. You do interact with the other teams during like meal times and workouts and things like that, and in other groups, because you have groups with your team and then they have specialized groups that you get put into depending on your issues. So you do interact with other people, but your team is kind of who you spend the most time with. You go on community service things with them on the weekends when you have the privilege to do that, and off-campus activities on Fridays. If you're on, I think you have to be on the third level to be able to go on off-campus activities. But the day-to-day structure was basically we would wake up, have breakfast, and there was a ton of stuff that happened even before breakfast of, having to be in line, sitting silently. We would have, well, let me back up by talking about community roles a little bit. Basically, every team had different roles that needed to be filled on their team. So each team had the same community roles, but different people filling them. So the first one that you're usually put on it when you're on the second level, is called Thumper. And you have to wake up 10 minutes before everybody else and wake them up and make sure they're in line on time. And there was another community role called Cover Girl, who had to make sure we were all in dress code. So we would have to stand there and they would make us raise our arms to make sure that our stomachs wouldn't show. And if we were wearing shorts, that they were the proper length and things like that. It was just very strict. They had a lot of rules about clothes and what could be on shirts and how long they could be and how thick straps, it was just very every part of our lives was controlled by this place. We would have breakfast, and then on the weekends or on the weekdays, we would have school from, I think, like 8 a.m. to like noon. And then we would have lunch. And after that, we would usually have like a group, like a therapy group. I forget what days we had what, but we had like a schedule of like every Monday we would have this group, every Tuesday we would have this type of group. And some of the groups were things like they would do like art therapy and DBT and things like that could have legitimately been helpful if they had been like taught by people who knew what they were doing and like actually had like, the credentials to be teaching DBT and things like that. But the majority of them didn't. One of the groups that we had that I always dreaded was called Feedback Group. And we would have that, I think, every Tuesday. And that was basically attack therapy. It was just a time for we all sit in a circle and they pick someone who maybe has had a bad attitude or something, and everyone just is required to pretty much attack them. Not as violent as happened in like places like Cedu and Alon. Like there wasn't really much screaming and things like that, but it was just like very intense humiliation. One of the groups that it was kind of like a feedback group, but it was impromptu. This happened in my first week there. We all got called into the main building where we like ate meals and things, like the entire program, which didn't happen much. We usually just had these kind of like impromptu meetings with our teams, but this was the entire program. And they call us into this room, and there is a giant circle of all these chairs in the middle of the floor. And inside of that, there is a circle of like 5 chairs that are all facing out. And they told these 5 girls that they needed to sit in the inside, and then they had all of us sit around the outside. And pretty much for the next hour or so, we were just encouraged to shame them because, get this, they had become too good of friends with each other and they were being cliquey. And that was their way of dealing with them.
They wouldn't want that type of thing to happen. So they kind of make you all keep each other at arm's length by snitching on each other or shaming each other in sessions, which of course if you don't do, you'll then be forced to endure the shaming yourself.
Exactly. Yeah. It was like there was actually someone who tried to stand up for them, and she ended up getting like reamed by this therapist. Honestly, like she was saying like, I don't think that they're I don't think they're cliquey. I don't think they're being exclusive. Like I think I consider myself friends with them. And the therapist, like, which this guy was awful. He doesn't work there anymore, thank God. But unfortunately works at another program now, he turns to her and he goes, really, you think any of these girls would be friends with you outside of here? And like that shut her up super. Like it was just that kind of environment of like just we were getting attacked like all the time. And at one point they called on me because I was new, and they called out one of the girls in the inner circle, and they were like, I bet you don't even know her name, I bet you don't even know where she's from, and all this stuff, just like putting me on the spot, which I was like, I don't want any of this attention on me right now. Like, I'm sorry, I just got here, I don't know what's going on. So that was kind of my introduction to the type of environment that Solstice was. And we had groups like that a lot, actually, usually just with our teams, but that one was with the entire program and was probably one of the worst ones. We had, getting back to groups, they put us in different groups depending on our issues. So if you had like a substance abuse problem, you were in substance abuse group. They put me into a group called Healthy Boundaries Group, which is one of the worst things to remember from my experience, because that group was extremely traumatizing. It was run by my therapist, actually, which is part of why I was put in there. And I was not a promiscuous person. I was a virgin. I had like a boyfriend before, and we'd like kissed and stuff, but nothing like extreme. And I was basically put in that group because I had been assaulted. And we nicknamed it Slut Shaming Group because that's pretty much what it was. It was just the therapist talking about how we were all so promiscuous and that we needed to like save ourselves and all this stuff. And yeah, it's awful. One of the things that you have to do to get out of it, like when you're done with the group graduating, you had to write down a detailed sexual history and share it with the entire group. And that was humiliating, obviously. And because my therapist was the person who ran that group, she actually also didn't tell me about this until I was on the phone with my parents for our family therapy call that week. But she made me share my entire sexual history with my parents as well, which was one of the honestly, one of the most humiliating moments of my entire life. Just, yeah.
Oh my goodness, Abby, that sounds horrible. You're trying to overcome this trauma that you've experienced and this abuse that you've been through, which has had a domino effect on your mental health and well-being throughout the years leading up to your time at Solstice. And you're put in a group that basically victim blames you for being assaulted. That is absolutely abhorrent, Abby. I'm so sorry that happened to you. That's awful.
It's okay. I mean, it's not okay, but I've dealt with it now to a point where I can actually like talk about it and without crying. But one of the things that really struck me when I first got there was, obviously I felt like the assault had been my fault before getting there, just because I feel like when people go through things like that, they naturally kind of look for, oh, well, what did I do? Did I have some of the blame? So I already felt kind of like it was my fault, but I knew from, culturally that no, it's not the victim's fault. And I kind of expected a little bit more of like that kind of environment when I got there to like, reassure me. But one of the first assignments you do at Solstice is called the Letter of Accountability, which you have to write this long letter detailing every bad thing you've ever done and the reasons that you were sent to Solstice, and you send it to your parents. And I actually had to rewrite mine like 3 or 4 times because my therapist wanted me to include my sexual assault in that, and she wouldn't let me send it until I had basically taken accountability for being sexually assaulted because I had been drinking when it happened. I had to take accountability for being assaulted, and that continued throughout our therapy, where she would talk about that a lot and say, well, if you hadn't been drinking, then that wouldn't have happened, and all this stuff. It was just, I've never had a therapeutic experience like that in my entire life, and I've been in therapy pretty much since that and before it. Every therapist I've spoken to has been like, there's no way, like nobody would ever say that.
There's so many different problems with everything that you've just said regarding this one woman. Is she like staunchly Mormon?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
She's probably being brought up with these messages that sex is sinful, and if you are involved in it in any way, especially as a woman, that makes you unclean and it's your fault, no matter how the interaction has happened, and the purity culture is so prevalent in the regimented clothes that you have to wear and the way that you are modestly supposed to present yourself within this program. This woman cannot be a licensed therapist, surely.
She is. I actually looked up her license. She is a licensed marriage and family therapist. She got her degree from BYU. So yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Whenever I tell people outside who don't understand, maybe don't know much about the troubled teen industry, their first thought is, well, there's no way that these people are licensed. There's no way that these are real therapists, but they are. And that was shocking to me too, because there are so many other therapists who did and said similar things that were all licensed and have a clean record, and yet they have done these things for years and years and years. Like it's mind-blowing.
I'm so sorry that happened to you, Abby. It's inexcusable for you to be blamed in any way whatsoever, no matter the condition you're in, or you've been drinking, or the clothes you're wearing, or the area that you're in, or the friends you're hanging out with, or any of the external conditions that, you know, were in effect when this abuse happened. None of that leads to you being responsible for your own sexual assault. Absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah.
And must have been so damaging. That is not, you know, that's anti-therapy.
Exactly. No, and I definitely know that now, but for a long time afterwards, I had like I became brainwashed when I was at Solstice. Like I truly was. And there are a lot of examples of how I was brainwashed, but one of the things was that I really truly believed that had been my fault, and I ended up actually getting assaulted after I left Solstice, again, actually right before I went to college, by someone who was a very close friend of mine. And I had been drinking at the time, but not very much. I had like a beer and was spending the night with a bunch of friends at one of their houses and was assaulted by this kid when I was asleep. And when I told my parents about that, their first reaction was kind of like, oh, well, you had been drinking, right? And that was something that really damaged me, that comment. And that my parents are wonderful people. I love them so much. But that was all Solstice.
I was then going to say, you know, you mentioned brainwashing, but the extent of it is it's going further than just your own experience at this point. You know, even from the evaluations that your parents were sent, the phone conversations, the family therapy, it's being controlled and it's all being moved in the direction that the therapist wants it to go in, very carefully and meticulously, through her getting you to rewrite. It's like a coerced confession, isn't it? You know, we hear about false confessions.
Yep.
And people are told that they're led and directed and coached to the position that the person wants them to be in. So by getting you to rewrite that 3 or 4 times until she's like, okay, I'm happy with that, now you can send it. Absolutely ridiculous that this person is in a position of authority.
Exactly.
And how do your parents feel about the programs now?
Oh, they're on my side with it. It took a while to get there, but they've apologized many times, and I really genuinely do forgive them. They didn't know what they were getting into. They were listening to professionals, or who they thought were professionals, who, you know, they were trusting these people who said this is the only place that she can be or she's going to kill herself. They didn't know what was going on there. I had no way of telling them because all of my communication was monitored and censored. So I really don't blame them whatsoever. They really were trying to do what was best for me. And I think I probably would have done the same thing if I were in their shoes and I didn't know anything like about the industry. It's very tempting to be able to have this place go, oh, well, we can solve everything and keep her safe and everything will be fine, when it's really just not the case at all. Yeah, and going along with the forced confession or false confession kind of thing that you were mentioning, that happens a lot in troubled teen programs, especially Solstice. Like I had to admit to things that I had never done before because they were convinced that I was lying if I said I hadn't done those things. So, for example, they knew that I had drank a handful of times. I was living in Australia where, you know, drinking culture is very prevalent and a lot of my friends were drinking. So when we went to parties, I would drink, and I definitely was way too young to be doing that kind of stuff. But I was also really depressed and kind of using it as like a little bit of an escape, I think. But they knew that I had drank like a handful of times. And when I told them that no, that's, I was only at parties, I'm not an alcoholic, like I just, I was a teenager experimenting. They didn't believe me, and they wouldn't let me kind of move forward with the program until I admitted that, I had been drinking every night by myself in my room, and, I drank at school. Like I would bring liquor to school and drink it and all this stuff that never happened. I never did anything like that, but that became part of my narrative because that was the only way that they would let me move forward, was if I admitted that all of these things were happening. And then of course, during family therapy, I would tell my parents these things, and they were like, oh my God, this was so much worse than we even knew. Thank God she's at this program. So it kind of serves to like, wow, look how incredible this program is. We didn't even know it was that bad, but she definitely needs to be here, and she definitely needs to finish the program. We didn't, it happens a lot in these programs, and it's just so infuriating. It actually took pretty much until like 2 years ago for my parents to realize all the lies that I was forced to tell them. And we've since gone through and I've corrected the narrative. It's just mind-blowing, the things that happen in these programs.
And you mentioned that there were certain types of punishments that were used at Solstice as well. So there are some experiences that we've heard about on the show where, similarly to what you've just mentioned, in RAPS, for examples, in CEDU programs, and I know that terminology is extended to other programs as well, you were not allowed to finish that session or have the spotlight taken off of you until you admitted to something you'd never done. But it wasn't just the attack therapy and the scream therapy and the public shaming that were used as forms of control and tools of punishment. There was actually, in Aspen Institute, something similar that was used in Solstice.
Yeah, so the main punishments, they kind of all go off of each other. So I'm going to quickly describe just like kind of the main ones. But there was comm block, which is similar in all programs. It's also called communication restriction, silence, code silence, things like that, where you're just forbidden from speaking for an indefinite period of time. Sometimes you're only not allowed to speak to a person or a couple people, and sometimes you're not allowed to speak to anybody. If you broke a more serious rule, you were put on safety, which was supposed to be like a precautionary level that's only used if you're like a danger to yourself or others, but people were put on it extremely excessively. Like we weren't allowed to touch each other at all unless you asked permission from staff to like high five someone or hug someone. So if you touched somebody without getting that, you could be put on safety, even if it's just like, touching someone's shoulder when you're passing or like high-fiving someone. Like that could be something that warranted safety. And basically when you're on safety, you lose all of your privileges. You have to be arm's length from a staff at all times. You don't get to sleep in your room. You have to sleep on the floor in the kitchen right next to a night staff. It usually results in your level being dropped when you get off of it. So if you're on like, I don't think I ran through the levels, but the levels were based on like the hero's journey, and they were orientation, separation, threshold, initiation, transformation, atonement, and return. Let's say you were on transformation when you get on safety. When you get off, you're probably going to be on threshold or initiation. You're probably going to have your level dropped at least one level, which results in you staying in the program for a longer time. So that's the main thing about safety and why people don't want to get on it. I mean, it sucks being on safety, but it also means you're going to be at Solstice for probably a couple more months than you would have been otherwise. And if you misbehave on safety, they have something called basement restriction, which is where you are literally confined to the basement of the lodge 24 hours a day. You're not allowed to leave to do school. You eat all your meals down there. You are automatically on comm block. You're literally just in the basement. You're only allowed to talk to the staff member that has to sit with you, and you're not allowed to do anything except for work on your safety assignments, which are basically just written assignments about how you violated the safety code and what you're going to do to not do that in the future. And then in order to get off of safety and basement restriction, you have to go in front of the safety council, which is a council of higher level students. I was on a few of them when I was close to graduating, and they make you basically go up in front of this panel of your peers that are on upper levels, and you have to explain what you did to break safety code, go through all of your assignments. And then we, as the panel, were basically in charge of recommending what level they should get onto when it's done. And if you wanted to give them back the same level, then you would get in trouble. Like, you had to kind of say like that their level should be dropped, or else staff would, get angry at you for going too easy on them. And, you're cheating them out of the full experience because you're going easy on them and all this stuff. They don't deserve their level back. And it's like, okay, this person like told a dirty joke. Do you really think that should result in them being like locked in a basement for 2 weeks and then losing their level? Like,
just making the kids complicit in their coercion.
Oh, totally. Yeah. We were required to snitch on others and basically abuse each other.
But when you've been in that environment for like a year plus and you've been treated so awfully, if you're given the opportunity to have the pressure taken off of you, human nature means that the majority of people would be happy to just not be the person that's being thrown into the punishment at that point, whether that meant that you were complicit in doling out the punishment yourself, which again is probably how a lot of people end up on these programs as staff members. They go through this awful treatment. They have this opportunity to punish other people instead of themselves be punished, and then think, wow, actually, I really enjoy this. I'm 18 now, so they can just pay me to carry on doing this type of thing. I'm sure that there is a psychological term that you would apply to that type of treatment. But again, it's all cleverly by design, isn't it? It serves the agenda perfectly.
Totally. It's ridiculous. And it is Stockholm Syndrome. I think I've seen that a lot of survivors describe it that way to the people who are still brainwashed, or the people who went back to, work at their programs or created a new program that was almost identical and things like that. It really is. It's once you have been abused in this situation for long enough, and then you finally are perceived as, making progress, and you gain privileges, and the spotlight's no longer on you, you start feeling like, oh, this isn't so bad. Like, yeah, all this stuff happened, but now I get to like, read books, and now I get to go outside by myself and things like that. And it really is all by design, this whole behavior modification.
Just as you're coming towards the other end of it as well, you mentioned it was towards your graduations. When you leave, you might be less inclined to report all of the abuses that you were forced to endure whilst you were there.
Exactly.
Oh, so when you're on this communication block, we've heard this be put similar in other programs called mattress restriction. Is the same as the basement restriction that you mentioned there, where somebody is told they have to sit on their mattress with one member of staff watching them all the time. We've heard it called table restriction, silence restriction, where people have to wear signs around their necks or a certain colored t-shirt that tells everybody that they're not allowed to make eye contact with anyone, that they're not allowed to speak to anyone, and all they're allowed to do is sit at their table and do writing assignments, which are used again then in public shaming or in family therapy. So everybody is just singing from the same hymn book with all of these different strategies that are being used. And you mentioned the word incestuous. So it's easy to see how these methods have been made universal across the board, from one person taking their inspiration to the next program and so on and so forth. We've talked a little bit about your relationship with your parents now, but I wondered what life was like for you after you graduated. Did the program have any merit to it whatsoever? Did you come out of it feeling like you had any tools to manage any of that stuff? Or was there just a whole host of other issues that you were now having to deal with?
Definitely initially, I thought that I was like cured. I think most of it just came from the fact that I was proud of myself for having gotten through it and graduating. And I felt like I was on top of the world, and I was thoroughly brainwashed. I thought that Solstice was the best thing that ever happened, and I was actually like recommending it to parents who they would put me in contact with, who were thinking about sending their kids there, which I feel so guilty about. But I was extremely brainwashed, and I didn't really start thinking about my experience differently until I started opening up to people about it. I became like very terrified of people who hadn't gone to the program. Like, I was starting a new high school because I couldn't go back to the public school in my town. It was just a really bad environment. My parents were like, that's going to be the worst place for you ever. It's just very like everyone's all up in each other's business all the time, and like parents gossiping about each other's kids and things like that. It's just really toxic environment.
Sounds like the Mormon community.
Yeah, exactly. So I went to this private school, and I was very anxious about it because I didn't know how to function outside of the program. I felt like I had a new mind, and I didn't know how to process situations outside of the program. I felt super codependent on the program. And the Solstice actually told us that once we got out, we shouldn't tell people about where we were. We shouldn't mention that we went to, an RTC, or, they'll think you're crazy. They won't understand it. So they pretty much told us, like, don't tell anybody about your experience. So I didn't for a long time. I went to this new school, which was the best high school. I went to a lot of different high schools, and that was easily the best one. I ended up having to repeat junior year because the school at Solstice was a joke, but that was fine because I was young for my grade anyway. So I repeated junior year and made a lot of really great friends. I got into a relationship pretty quickly after I got out, which was good for the first couple of years. And, I was in a good place, but I didn't tell anybody about my experience. And I started noticing that I was having a lot of anxiety and nightmares, and kind of these things that, looking back on, definitely were symptoms of PTSD that I was just kind of ignoring because I felt like, I was cured and all of this stuff. And I really didn't think anything was wrong with Solstice until I decided to open up about it to my boyfriend at the time. And I very bare bones, I didn't ever plan on telling anybody about it, but he kind of noticed the inconsistencies in my cover story that I had told him about. Oh, I went to a boarding school because I had to catch up on credits after I got back from Australia, that he was finding holes in it. And one day I just decided to tell him a very vague description of it, and he was absolutely shocked. I didn't even get into some of the abusive stuff. I didn't get into pretty much any of the abusive stuff. I just basically told him it was an RTC and it was really strict, and described some of the rules and the assignments we had to do, whether that be wearing a sign around your neck saying these are my issues, ask me about them, or there was a girl that had to carry around a 50-pound backpack filled with rocks for 6 months because she couldn't let go of her problems, and they were supposed to represent all of the things she was carrying with her, whatever. Things like that were not the worst things, but they were still messed up. And my boyfriend at the time was shocked. He started crying and literally cried for the next 3 days straight, pretty much, anytime that we talked about it or he thought about it. That was kind of in my mind when I was oh wait, maybe this place wasn't that great. And I started reflecting on it and thinking back about it. It was the veil had been lifted. All of a sudden I was oh my God, none of that was okay. And from then I just kept remembering more and more stuff. And that was at the end of my junior year. So it was a little bit less than a year after I got out. And then my senior year, I was taking a memoir class, and I decided to write my final project, or my memoir, about my time in Utah. And I wasn't sure if I was ready to kind of process it, but I was why not? So I met with my teacher beforehand, before I started writing it, just to make sure that it was an okay topic to talk about. And I was telling her some of this stuff, and she was just staring at me, mouth open, just are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? And she started crying at some parts. I felt so bad because I was I really want to I don't know, get this on paper before I, forget things. And that was another moment where I was okay, this was really messed up. I have my teacher in here crying.
Well, she's a person that's given her life and career to educate others in a safe environment, so a decent teacher is probably thinking, imagine the students that we have now existing in these conditions, I think that's a typical response. Some people in your position might have been just wow, why are they reacting that way? It wasn't, it was fine. It was good. It was helpful, which could either be a genuine reaction or part of the thought reform that's taken place. Wow, that's
Yep.
amazing that you were able to recognize then that
Yeah.
things didn't add up.
Yeah, no, it was that memoir definitely was kind of the beginning of me really processing that. We would do peer reviews and stuff throughout the semester, and people would read mine and just be like, what is this place? Like, what is going on? And I did not share a ton of it. Like, I did not really go into detail about the abuse. I more focused it on just like how I felt trapped and how it wasn't helpful. And, that was kind of the like theme of it. And it was only supposed to be like 15 pages long, so it wasn't like a huge in-depth thing, but it definitely helped me process my time there. And when I graduated high school, I kind of felt like I had dealt with it. Like that, I was like, all right, I'm, off to college, off to a new part of my life, never have to think about any of that ever again. Then I really started struggling in my sophomore and junior years. I was having horrible anxiety to the point where like I lost like 20 pounds because I couldn't eat anything. I was like very lethargic. I was disorganized, just overall not caring for myself. And I had this like horrible anxiety in groups being around people, and I couldn't understand why I was having all these issues because I was at a really good school with great friends and I was getting good grades, and I just couldn't understand why my life was kind of crumbling like that. And then the end of 2020, when I heard that Paris Hilton was going to be releasing a documentary about her time in Utah, that's kind of when I had my like second awakening, I would say, where I actually started thinking about it a little bit more critically and wanting to get involved in the activism side of it. I watched that documentary when it came out at midnight. I stayed up for like the release of it. And that was the first time in my life that I had ever heard somebody else talking about the things that I had been through too. And I felt like not alone for the first time since that experience. And ever since then, it was just like a rabbit hole for me. That's when I started researching Solstice and Aspen and getting involved in the subreddit. And it's pretty much been like that ever since. And it really has been a helpful experience for me, healing wise. The more I understand about it, the more I feel comforted and am able to kind of process my experience. I'm a scientific person. I was a bio major and a chem minor. So like I've always kind of been the person who likes to just see like data laid out in front of me, and like the more I understand about things, like the more comfortable I feel with them. So that's kind of what I've done with the research I do for the subreddit and other places as well. But the more I understand about the industry, the more I'm able to kind of accept my experience and move on from it and not feel so like trapped behind like all of the painful memories and the nightmares and the PTSD and the symptoms that come from that. And yeah, it's been a really rewarding experience for me.
Not just to understand it all, but to help other people understand their experiences as well. I can't imagine how empowering and cathartic that must feel after you stayed up to watch this documentary with Paris Hilton because you had never experienced somebody else talking out about a similar experience.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, the wiki is, if I had found the wiki like a month after I left Solstice, I feel like I would have processed everything a lot quicker. And that's what I'm partially one of my hopes for the wiki, is that it helps survivors who maybe just got out of a program and are still brainwashed, but are starting to see some of the cracks, that they can find that and be like, oh wow, this is actually like, okay, those little thoughts in my head that maybe it wasn't okay, they're actually correct, and I shouldn't be ashamed of having these like anti-program thoughts.
Oh, it's amazing the work that you're doing. Because when you type in something into Google, typically Wikipedia is the first thing that will pop up. So not only having the list of resources on the subreddit, I mean, Wikipedia is definitely something I feel like is much more accessible and known by people who may not know about Reddit. So absolutely amazing that you're doing that as well.
Definitely.
And for somebody like Paris Hilton, who you might have seen her on reality TV and thought that she was a very privileged person, that she came from a certain type of family. Somebody like Paris Hilton surely could have never have gone to one of these types of programs. Surely they would have never treated the daughter or the granddaughter of a tycoon the way that she was treated when she was at Provo Canyon. And then she's like, yes, all of these things happened to me. And then you start to see Paris Hilton in a completely different light. But you also start to realize that any single child can be placed into one of these programs under the right set of circumstances, no matter their background, and be subjected to the same type of abuse.
Exactly. And there are actually so many celebrities' kids who have gone to troubled teen programs. It's actually shocking how many there are. Like a couple other celebrities have come out since, and people who, you know, either their parents are famous or they get famous later. It shocked me just how many survivors there are. I felt super alone when I was in Utah. I thought that like Solstice and Aspen and Island View were like the only programs that existed, and I was very wrong. And of course, I mean, it breaks my heart that there are so many survivors, but it also, I think, is very empowering that so many of us are like deciding to finally speak up about it. And there is strength in numbers. Like people are listening to us now, which has never happened before, really, in the history of, you know, this advocacy work.
And of course, when you talk about there being so many survivors, there are also a lot of people that aren't here today because of their experiences within the troubled teen industry, or at least their experiences have played a part in an individual's decision to take their own life. And on top of that, there are people who have died as a result of being a part of one of these programs that hasn't been from a completion of suicide, but actually from medical neglect. These are the type of headline articles that are creating waves within the certain areas of America, looking at the troubled teen industry and saying, oh my goodness, kids are dying inside these programs, but it shouldn't have had to get to that point in the first place for people to recognize that things needed to change.
Exactly.
The biggest news story with the biggest momentum at the moment is the Agape boarding school. And then there is the other case at the moment, which seems to be picking up some traction around the girl from Maple Lake Academy as well.
So Agape boarding school, it's in Missouri. I haven't been following the news as closely as I probably should be. I've had a pretty hectic last couple months, but a lot of survivors are speaking out and trying to get that program shut down. It's had years and years and years of abuse, and there are some very vocal survivors in Missouri who have been campaigning for a long time and meeting with legislators and everything. And actually, it's related to it had a girls program that was kind of connected, Circle of Hope, which just got shut down, I think last year or possibly late 2020. I think it was last year. And the owners were arrested and charged with rape and abuse, among other things. And that was spearheaded by their own daughter, actually, the daughter of the people who own the program. So a lot has been happening in Missouri recently. It's good to see, but it's equally as heartbreaking that so many horrible things had to happen before people finally decided that it was enough. And the Maple Lake Academy situation is just as heartbreaking. A girl dying due to medical neglect, and that's what it took for Utah to finally step in. And they said they were going to shut the program down, but they didn't. They put their license on provisional while the investigation goes on, and it's looking likely that they're going to be able to open back up. And it's infuriating to me that they still keep getting away with this. And I just don't want it to have to take the death of a resident to shut these places down. Like, why would you let it get that far? If there are these situations where kids are even almost dying in these programs, and any part of it is due to neglect, then why would you let that program continue to run, knowing that a couple years from now, another kid won't be lucky enough to survive? Like, it infuriates me. We had a medical neglect case at Solstice while I was there that I recently found the lawsuit about. She sued them, but she was given a 10 to 20% chance of survival when she finally got to the hospital. She had been sick for days, and kept begging to be taken to the hospital. The staff said, no, you're faking it. They consulted with the psychiatrist and they said, oh, she's, it's just in her head. It's fine. They did her blood pressure a couple times and it was too low to register on the machine. And they just kind of chalked it up to the machine being faulty. And she finally was taken to the hospital when her blood pressure was so low it literally wasn't able to be read. And one staff member actually believed her and took her to the hospital. And she was immediately put in the ICU. She was in septic shock, double kidney failure, among other things. Like she was very, very close to dying. Her organs were shutting down. She had to be put in a coma for 11 days, and thank God she woke up, but she was very, very close to dying, and that was entirely Solstice's fault. So she filed a lawsuit. I don't know the outcome of it. I'm sure they settled out of court to keep it as quiet as possible, but that should never have happened. And all of us at the program when that happened, we all thought that she had died because we didn't see her again. Like she left to go to the hospital. We knew she was really sick and she never came back, and we were forbidden from saying her name even or talking about her. I think they were pretty sure that she was going to die and just didn't want to have to deal with us finding out about that. So they just cut all conversations off. And I didn't find out about any of that until I reconnected with her years later. It makes me so upset knowing that situations like that happen across the country and the world every single day, pretty much, of kids not being believed, especially in wilderness programs. It happens a ton in wilderness programs because you are in a dangerous situation where you have to worry about dehydration and exposure and exhaustion and, heat stroke, things like that. And you're sending your kids out there with people who are largely untrained and don't have great CPR or first aid experience, and you're in the middle of the wilderness. It's not like you can just drive over a couple minutes to go to a hospital if something does happen. It's more dangerous than a lot of these parents realize, and the deaths that have occurred in this industry really speak to the fact that there are issues. There's clearly issues if this many teenagers have died so early and so in such preventable ways. It's sickening.
There was also a lawsuit against Spring Ridge Academy, which I think has caused them to attempt to rebrand quite under the radar, but it's been picked up by the subreddit, and a few individuals have also sent me screenshots and emails to say this is what's happening. So I'm sure you were probably told about this, or maybe even had a hand in working it out in the earlier stages.
Yeah, it was, I saw it being posted about in the subreddit, which I always appreciate when people give updates like that. It makes it a lot easier for me to go in and make sure that I have all the correct information on the wiki. But yeah, I think it's called New Day Rising now or something along those lines, but it's the same program. We see this all the time. They, as soon as there's enough negative attention around the program, it's what they do. It's how they skirt accountability. And it's very unsurprising because Spring Ridge Academy in particular has been targeted quite a lot in the last 2 years by the Breaking Code Silence movement and other advocacy groups that are working for similar causes. Spring Ridge has connections to a lot of other programs that are prominent in the troubled teen industry, so it's definitely has gotten a lot of attention. So it's to be expected, in my opinion. And we're definitely closely monitoring that situation and making sure that they're not allowed to just quietly rebrand and, think that Spring Ridge Academy is closed, because it's still open.
And you recently went to Washington and met up with various different advocacy groups and individuals, including Paris Hilton, who is kind of spearheading a large portion of the advocacy work that's taken place. What was the purpose of your trip to Washington?
So originally we were going out there to support the introduction of a bill. It has two names kind of, but it's the Accountability and Congregate Care Act, which would be the first kind of federal legislation that would put federal oversight on troubled teen industry programs and other congregate care facilities. We were going to introduce it. It's not being introduced yet because of some, issues with the government and other things like that. But we will be introducing that soon. And I'm unsure if I'm going to make another trip out to DC, but the trip was still incredible. We were able to do a lot of local advocacy. We met with a few senators' teams and congressmen's teams just to let them know about the troubled teen industry in their state. And it was great to be able to provide them with facts about the programs that are in their states and, what is going on with them. And most of them had no idea that these places existed. So it was really rewarding. It was also super nice to just get to meet other survivors face to face. We had a couple activities and things like that. We had a candlelight vigil for victims of the troubled teen industry, and the families of some who died in the troubled teen industry also came and shared their stories. I was crying my eyes out the entire time, but it was super powerful and just a really incredible experience. I have never really felt that kind of sense of community in my entire life. It was just a really incredible experience, and I'm really excited for this bill. I think it has a good chance of doing a lot of good things in this industry, and I just really hope it gets passed, but I guess we'll see.
Yeah, the sooner the better, absolutely. So there can at least be some type of accountability to these programs, whether that's more regulation, whether that's shutting them down completely, whether that is introducing a standard for education. Any of these things we've just mentioned would make a small positive difference. All of those things together could completely transform the lives of young people for the better who are being sent to these programs. And that, of course, is the overall aim. So thank you so much, Abby, for all of the work you do, putting everything together, the super sleuthing, the support that is in place on the subreddit, and for the nurturing of that sub that creates such a positive and healthy environment for people heading over there to learn more, to speak to fellow survivors, to be validated in their own experiences, to understand that as a parent or primary caregiver, that, the blame isn't with them, to ask for alternatives to therapeutic centers, to ask if this school or program is good before I send my kids there, or my friend's being sent to this place. Can you tell me anything about it? There's so many different discussions that take place on the subreddit, and the wealth of resources are over there in terms of lists and lists and lists of different programs, and then the Wikipedia pages that you've created on the history of those programs and the staff link to those programs, and then the links to that staff have to other programs is absolutely incredible. Thank you so much for all of the time that you put into it, Abby. I really appreciate you emailing me and then willing to come and chat with me to tell the listeners about all of these wild links that you've been able to establish between the Mormon community and the troubled teen industry, but also the programs that have all of these internal links as well. And thank you for coming and sharing your personal story, and for allowing us to hear your deepest, most personal experiences and how they affected you and how you were able to overcome those things. I don't underestimate in any way how difficult it must be to have those conversations, but I hope in that same way you don't underestimate how priceless it is for other people to hear those things from fellow survivors on this show, and just know how much it will help them. So thank you for everything that you do, Abby.
Thank you. No, thank you for having me, and thank you so much for making so many episodes about the troubled teen industry. I originally found your podcast from the CEDU series that you did, and it really means so much that you're willing to advocate for us and use your platform to share our stories and information that you find about troubled teen programs and Synanon and things like that. Everything helps, and it's incredible. And thank you so much.
I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, Abby. Take care. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you. You too. Bye.
That is the end of this week's episode. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast.
Did you know 77% of women who wear bladder weakness products experience intimate skin irritation?
As if having incontinence wasn't stressful enough.
But Tena Intimate Pads have been gynecologist tested and do not cause skin irritation.
Gentle on my intimate skin. I need to try Tena Intimate Pads.
Visit TenaSample.com for your free sample. Kind to skin, protects like Tena.